14 conversions are recorded in a tent meeting conducted at 8th and Pratt Streets by Reverend William Branham. I tried to reconcile this with the history of the message that I was taught. The prophet said that hundreds were converted and baptized at that meeting in 1933, and that the newspapers described a light shining from the heaven. The way the prophet described the scene, he was the center of focus while crowds large enough to gain national media attention were present and listening to God speak from the heavens. Yet, in the narrative presented through the weekly editions of Jeffersonville and Louisville newspapers, the Davis brothers were the center of focus, and not for their religion so much as for their controversy. The largest crowd reported in any newspaper that I could find for the prophet's meetings was 14 converts, which was a far cry from the hundreds that he described in his life story accounts. He claimed that the Associated Press packed the story, yet not a single digital archive of any newspaper in any city had record of such a story. Shortly after his tent revivals, the prophet became part of the Pentecostal lineup in Jeffersonville newspapers' church announcements. Though his church building was not yet reported, the newspapers reported that the prophet had a congregation. The late Miss Baldwin was a member when the prophet preached her funeral. This fact I did not find surprising, since the prophet described preaching in other buildings during the early days of his ministry. The name of his church, however, was surprising. The first mention of the prophet's church in the newspapers in 1935 was listed as the Pentecostal Tabernacle. Jeffersonville newspapers listed the prophet's Pentecostal church on Penn Street, just a short distance from the other Pentecostal churches. The prophet's Pentecostal church was on Penn Street, Davis's Pentecostal church was on Mechanic Street, and Roy Davis's church was on Watt Street. Ralph Rader's Pentecostal church was at the nearby Armory. The newspapers did not even mention Roy Davis's brother Wilbur or his son Roy Jr., who were now also ministers in Jeffersonville. Likely, they were appointed as evangelists. There were so many Pentecostals in such a small town. I thought back to the 1931 article describing the outrageous situation when Roy took a large part of Ralph Rader's congregation. I began to wonder, was the plan to take the rest of Ralph Rader's congregation? There weren't that many Pentecostal converts during that era, especially in the small town of Jeffersonville. With all of these Pentecostal churches, there was certainly some competition. Were they trying to drive Ralph Rader out of town?